The knock came at 7 in the evening, just as I was sitting down with a glass of wine and the particular silence I had spent 8 months learning to love. I wasn't prepared for what I heard through the door. His voice, smooth and infuriatingly composed, as though the last 8 months had been nothing more than a minor misunderstanding between neighbors. "Sara, I'm back. Let me in. I'm ready to forgive you and your mother. Set the table." I stood there, one hand on the door handle and one still clutching my glass, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not fury, not fear, not the old ache I used to confuse with love. I felt something cold and clear and precise, like the edge of a very well-maintained knife. Because he had said, "Forgive." He had come back after everything. After the documents, after the account transfers, after the night I had found his mother sitting at my kitchen table, going through my grandmother's will with a yellow highlighter and the calm of a woman who believes she cannot be stopped. And he had announced, from the other side of my front door, that he was prepared to forgive me. The audacity of it was so complete, so structurally perfect, that for a moment I almost admired it the way you admire something terrible that is also technically precise. I did not open the door right away. Instead, I pressed my back against the cool plaster of the hallway wall and let the memory carry me, the way it sometimes does when the body needs to remind the mind exactly how far it has traveled to reach solid ground. It had begun, as most catastrophes do, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March, the kind of morning that smells like damp earth and fresh coffee and the warm, particular scent of a house that belongs entirely to you. I remember standing at the kitchen window of the cottage my grandmother had left me, watching the cherry tree in the backyard push out its first pale blossoms against a sky that was the pale, washed blue of new beginnings, and thinking that this specific quality of light, this smell, this quiet, the way the floorboards creaked their familiar greeting under my bare feet, was everything I had ever wanted from a life. I was 31 years old. I had a job I was good at, a home I loved, and a husband I believed in with the whole unguarded weight of someone who has never had a reason not to. His name was Daniel. He had hazel eyes and a laugh that filled a room and a way of holding my hand that felt like a promise. And he had a mother named Eleanor, who, I would come to understand far too late, had never once in his 34 years of living stopped treating him as something she had made and therefore owned. The cottage itself was modest but beautiful in the way that old things sometimes are. Wide plank floors worn smooth and warm by decades of feet, a fireplace in the parlor that actually worked and smelled of applewood when we used it, a deep cast-iron sink in the kitchen that had been my grandmother Margaret's, and which I had filled with enough dish soap in my first week of ownership to embarrass myself thoroughly. Margaret had left the cottage to me specifically, not to my mother, not split between the family, but to me with my name alone on the deed, because I had been the one who visited her every Sunday for 7 years, who had sat beside her during her last winter, when the cold got into her lungs and the world got smaller and smaller, who had read to her from the same 3 novels she loved until the words became part of both of us. The deed had my name alone on it. This fact, I would later understand, was the entire reason Eleanor had ever smiled at me. Daniel and I had been married 3 years when we moved into the cottage. He had proposed in this very kitchen on a rainy November evening when the windows were completely fogged and something with too much garlic was burning pleasantly on the stove, and I had said yes before he finished the sentence because I genuinely, completely believed We were building something real together. He was thoughtful in the specific ways that actually matter. He remembered what I was afraid of before I named it. He noticed when I was tired before I mentioned it. He made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, entirely and unhurriedly seen. His mother was a complication I had decided to manage rather than solve. The way you manage a drafty window in an old house. You learn where it is. You avoid standing directly in its path. You tell yourself repeatedly that it isn't so bad, that every house has its compromises. Eleanor was 62, sharp-tongued in the manner of women who have long ago confused cruelty with a form of honesty, and she had strong opinions about everything from my haircut to the correct way to load a dishwasher to the precise moment a woman my age ought to be considering having children. She was not the kind of mother-in-law who raises her voice and breaks plates. She was far more dangerous than that. She was the kind who smiles warmly and pours you tea and repositions every piece on the board while asking you whether you take sugar. In those early years, I classified her as tiresome rather than threatening. She would ask, with the smoothest possible sweetness, what my salary was these days, how much a cottage like ours might go for on the market, whether my mother had any claim to Margaret's estate given the way the will had been worded. I answered her honestly each time, because I had been raised to believe that honesty was both generous and disarming. I was right about the generous part. Daniel had a way of managing his mother that I once, to my lasting embarrassment, mistook for emotional maturity. He would redirect conversations, fill dangerous silences with harmless noise, change subjects with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing it since childhood. What I misread as peacekeeping, I now understand was something closer to decades of rehearsed avoidance. The deeply grooved behavior of a man who had decided long ago that the cost of genuinely confronting Eleanor was higher than any other cost imaginable. He loved her the way you love a weather system, absolutely, helplessly, and without any illusion of influence. I should have recognized that pattern. I should have understood that any woman who has never once in her life been truly stopped will eventually simply take what she wants because she has spent decades learning that no one will stop her. The first hairline cracks appeared so gradually that I nearly missed them entirely, which I suspect was exactly the plan. It was a Sunday dinner at Eleanor's house in early October, the autumn before everything broke open, and I remember the smell of her kitchen precisely. Bleach underneath everything, layered over with something sweet and heavy, the particular aggressive sweetness of a perfume applied by a woman who intends to be noticed. Eleanor had made a roast, which she always did on Sundays with the regularity of a ritual, and the table was set with the specific precision of someone who uses domesticity as a form of demonstration. The silverware was aligned, the napkins were folded. The whole room said, "This is a woman in control of her environment." I helped clear the plates after dinner, carrying the good china carefully to the kitchen counter, and Eleanor, with her back to me at the sink, asked in the most offhand voice imaginable whether Daniel and I had ever considered adding her name to the cottage deed. "For mutual protection," she said, not turning around, rinsing a plate with the focused attention of someone discussing the weather, in case anything happened to either of you. "You know how these things can get complicated." I laughed. I actually laughed, because the question was so structurally absurd that my brain had categorized it as a joke before my nervous system could register it as a threat. Daniel said nothing. He was at the other end of the kitchen, looking at his wine glass on the counter, turning the stem slowly between two fingers the way he did when he was thinking about something he didn't want to say out loud. He did not look up. I said something polite and non-committal. Something about how we hadn't thought about it, how the cottage was well sorted, how we'd look into estate planning properly when we were older. And I filed the moment under the heading of Eleanor being Eleanor and moved on with the evening. It was only later, washing my own dishes in my own kitchen with the radio on low and the cherry tree a dark shape outside the window, that I noticed the thing that had been wrong with the scene. Daniel had not looked at his mother when she asked that question. He had looked at his wine glass, which meant he had known the question was coming, which meant this had not been a spontaneous thought from a worried mother. This had been a trial run. I told myself I was imagining things. I had always been good at telling myself that. The weeks that followed had a particular quality of stillness that I would later recognize as the pressurized quiet before something structural gives way, the kind of silence that isn't peace, but the absence of noise that ought to be there. Daniel started taking phone calls in the spare room with the door nearly closed. Not closed, which would have been obvious, but nearly, leaving a gap of 2 or 3 inches as though the door itself could provide plausible deniability. I passed the hallway twice and caught fragments. His voice, very low, choosing each word with care. When I asked who he'd been talking to, he said his mother, and his eyes dropped briefly to his phone before he looked up. "She's anxious about some financial stuff," he said. "You know how she gets." I nodded and said, "Of course," and asked if there was anything I could help with, and he said, No, it's fine. She just needs to feel heard," and I told myself that was probably true because I needed it to be. He became harder to reach in the small ways that are almost impossible to name or confront. Not cold. Daniel was never cold, which was part of what made this so difficult. He was still warm, still present in the surface ways, still made coffee the way I liked it and asked about my day. But there was a new layer beneath all of it, a slight thickness in the air between us, like the early stages of frost on a window, barely visible, but unmistakably there if you pressed your fingers against it. He agreed with me too quickly in conversations, the nod coming before I'd finished speaking. He forgot things I'd told him. Twice I mentioned something about a work trip and found days later that it had not registered at all. When I told him that Eleanor had called me at work, twice in 1 week, asking with elaborate casualness whether I'd looked into any estate planning, whether my mother had ever consulted a solicitor about Margaret's will, he said she was just anxious. "You know she worries. Let's not turn it into something." I looked at his face carefully. I watched the almost imperceptible tightening along his jaw, that particular set of his mouth that he gets when he's managing something he'd prefer not to examine. And I thought, with a clarity I immediately tried to talk myself out of, he is not reassuring me, he's performing reassurance. There is a difference, and I'm only just learning to see it. It was a Wednesday in November when the performance finally developed a crack wide enough to see through. The heating had malfunctioned that morning, some issue with the boiler that I'd tried to describe to the repairman over the phone and failed to convey adequately. And he couldn't come until Friday, so I was working from home, wrapped in a coat and 2 sweaters, and the particular martyred resolve of a person determined not to be defeated by their own house. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop and a mug of tea going cold at my elbow when my phone rang and showed my mother's name. Ruth doesn't call in the middle of a workday without reason. She considers it a form of impoliteness toward people's professional commitments, and she has maintained this position even in minor emergencies. So when I saw her name on the screen, something in my chest went very still before I picked up. Her voice was careful, measured. The voice she uses when she has decided that the information she's carrying needs to be delivered precisely rather than quickly. She said, "Sara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Have you recently signed anything related to the cottage? Any kind of document? A deed amendment, a power of attorney, anything at all?" I said, "No." "Why?" The pause lasted 3 seconds. I counted them without meaning to. Then she said, "I ran into Patricia Lowe this morning at the pharmacy. You remember her, she works part-time at the county recorder's office. She was being very careful about what she said, but she mentioned, very indirectly, that a document had recently been filed relating to your property. She couldn't tell me what it was, but she thought you should know." I sat very still in my coat in my cold kitchen. Outside, the cherry tree stood stripped to its bones against a white sky. The cast-iron sink, my grandmother's sink, which had held 50 years of ordinary mornings, caught the pale light from the window and held it. I told my mother I would look into it. I hung up. I made another cup of tea I didn't drink, and I sat for a long time looking at the frost beginning to crystallize on the lower pane of the window, and I thought, there is a reasonable explanation. There is always a reasonable explanation. And then, immediately after, with the quiet precision of something that has been building for weeks, but what if there isn't? That evening, I did something I had not done in 3 years of marriage. I went through Daniel's desk. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters when you are trying to understand the exact geography of the moment a life divides. I did not go in anger, and I did not go with my hands shaking. I went in the specific, deliberate calm of a woman who has decided she needs the truth more than she needs the comfort of not knowing it. Daniel was at a colleague's leaving drinks, not expected back until 10:30. The desk was in the spare room. The room with the nearly closed door, the room with the low, careful voice, and it was ordinarily very tidy, which I had always interpreted as Daniel being an organized person, and which I was now beginning to reinterpret as something else entirely. The top drawer held pens, a phone charger, an old strip of photo booth pictures. The two of us at some summer fair, squinting into the brightness and laughing at something one of us had just said. I held those for a moment. I put them back exactly where they were. The bottom drawer was heavier than it ought to have been, and it stuck slightly on the left side when I pulled it. And there, beneath a manila folder of old car insurance documents, was a second folder, pale green, unmarked, the kind that comes in packs of 10. My hands were steady when I opened it. I need you to understand that steady, not trembling, which surprised some distant part of me, the part that was still watching this happen from a slight remove. Inside were 4 documents. The first was a property deed amendment, drafted by a solicitor whose name I did not recognize, listing 3 names, mine, Daniel's, and Eleanor's. The second was a power of attorney document granting Eleanor the right to act on my behalf in all matters relating to the property, signed at the bottom with a version of my signature that was close enough to pass a casual glance and wrong enough, if you have written your own name 10,000 times, to be unmistakably not yours. The third was a letter from the solicitor to Daniel, dated 6 weeks earlier, confirming the documents were prepared and ready to file upon receipt of both final signatures. The fourth was a note in Eleanor's handwriting, her precise, looping, careful script on a small piece of notepaper. It said, "Daniel, once this is filed, the cottage is protected for the family. Sara will understand eventually. She always does. She always does." I read those 3 words 4 times. I read them until they stopped looking like language and became simply shapes on cream-colored paper. And then I read them a 5th time so I could feel the full particular weight of what they contained. Not, Sara may be upset. Not, Sara will need convincing. But Sara will understand eventually. As though I were a temporary atmospheric condition in a plan that had been in motion long before I had stood in Eleanor's kitchen with its bleach smell and its performance of a roast, long before Daniel had turned his wine glass slowly in his fingers without looking at his mother or at me. As though my understanding, my consent, my name were simply administrative details to be resolved in due course. My heart was doing something slow and emphatic, pressing against the inside of my ribs with a kind of insistent weight, as though it were trying to make sure I registered what had just happened. I put the documents back precisely as I had found them. I closed the green folder. I closed the drawer. I went to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and stood watching the steam when it came, letting the ordinariness of the action hold me for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "She forged my signature. Daniel helped her prepare the documents. They've drafted a power of attorney and a deed amendment adding Eleanor to the cottage. Mum, she signed my name." The silence on her end lasted exactly as long as it takes a very practical woman to shift from receiving terrible news to deciding what to do about it. Then she said, in the particular measured voice she uses when she has moved into a mode I think of as strategic and precise, "Don't touch anything else tonight. Don't say a single word to Daniel. Tomorrow morning, first thing, you and I are going to see Martin Hess." Martin Hess was her solicitor. He had handled my grandmother's estate. He knew the deed and the will and the chain of title better than almost anyone. His number, I realized then, my mother had apparently been keeping at the ready for some time, which meant she had not been entirely surprised by what I had just told her, which meant she had been watching this develop and waiting with the quiet patience of a woman who was not going to move until she had something solid to move with. I said, "How long have you been worried about this?" She said, "Long enough. Try to sleep." I did not sleep. I lay in the bed we shared on my side of the mattress, listening to Daniel come home at 10:20. I heard him set his keys on the hallway table, the small ceramic dish I had bought at a market in Portugal, back when everything still felt like it was being built toward something real. And I heard him move through the house in the careful way of someone trying not to wake a person he assumes is sleeping. I heard him pause at the spare room, 40 seconds perhaps. Then the door opened again, and he came to the bedroom, and I kept my breathing slow and even while he got into bed beside me in the dark. I lay there completely still and thought, "You sat across from me at dinner last week and asked me how my day was, and you already knew." His breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep faster than it should have, which told me he was performing sleep the same way I was. We lay there together in the dark, both of us pretending, and the space between us was not 12 inches of mattress, but the entire geography of everything that had been done and decided without me. I was dressed and out of the house by 7:15 before Daniel's alarm. I left no note. I drove to my mother's house in the flat gray light of November, with both hands on the wheel and the green folder sealed in an envelope on the passenger seat. I was not crying. I was running on something cold and purposeful that burned clean and very hot. Martin Hess had a practice on the high street above a dry cleaner. He was 60, heavy-set with the unhurried manner of a man who has seen enough disasters to understand that the first thing people carrying them need is to be allowed to sit down. He read each document in sequence without speaking, holding each page with a deliberateness I found steadying. When he finished, he set the papers on his desk and looked at me over his glasses. "The power of attorney is fraudulent," he said. "The signature is a forgery. Your original is on file with this practice from your grandmother's estate, and the discrepancy is obvious. The deed amendment was filed 4 days ago. However, because the POA underpinning it was fraudulent, the amendment is legally void. We can have it reversed." He paused. "Have you spoken to your husband?" I said no. He said, "Good. Don't." "Not yet." Legally void. The plan Eleanor had constructed with such patience, such tidy precision. The highlighted will, the blank-eyed solicitor, the green folder, the certainty that Sara will understand eventually, was built on something that could not hold. By noon, I had the name of the solicitor Eleanor had used. By 12:30, I had a preliminary legal opinion confirming the forgery. By 1 o'clock, Daniel had called my phone 4 times. On the 5th call, I picked up. The 2-second silence when he realized I was there was its own confession. The sound of a man recalibrating, measuring how much ground had shifted. "Sara, where are you? Are you okay?" The performance was excellent. 3 years of watching him manage Eleanor had given him considerable practice at performing concern while managing something else entirely. "I know about the documents, Daniel," I said. "The power of attorney, the deed amendment, the solicitor in Ashford, and I know you knew. I know you helped her." Another silence. "Sara, listen. I don't want an explanation over the phone. Go to your mother's house. Both of you be there at 7 tonight." I hung up before he could find the next word. I arrived at Eleanor's house at 5 to 7. The window boxes still held late chrysanthemums, their petals beginning to loosen in the cold. Eleanor opened the door herself, which told me she had been watching the street. She was wearing a pressed blouse and her expression of rehearsed reasonableness. "Sara, come in. I'll put the kettle on." "I'm not here for tea, Eleanor," I said, and stepped past her. Daniel was in the sitting room near the window, arms crossed, the posture of a man who had been pacing and stopped at the sound of the bell. He said my name in the way he'd been saying it all day, as though repetition could restore it to meaning. I sat in the armchair across from the sofa, waited until Eleanor had settled with the composure of a woman in her own court, and then I set Martin Hess's letter on the coffee table. "That is a letter from my solicitor," I said. "He has copies of every document filed relating to my cottage over the past 6 weeks, including the fraudulent power of attorney bearing my forged signature. The deed amendment will be reversed within 72 hours. The solicitor in Ashford has been notified of the fraudulent submission and is now under Law Society review." The room was very quiet. The heating ticked. Eleanor looked at the letter with the expression of a woman revising her position rather than abandoning it. "Sara," she said in the smooth voice I once found merely tiresome and now recognized as a precisely constructed weapon, "I think you're being very emotional, and I understand that. But everything I did was for this family. The cottage is a significant asset, and it needed to be properly protected." "From me?" My voice was perfectly level. My name was the only name on that deed because my grandmother left it to me alone. I was there every Sunday for 7 years while she was dying. You had your son help you forge my signature to put your name on something that has never been yours. She opened her mouth. I held up one hand and she closed it. "I am not finished," I said. I had decided in the car that I would not shout, would not cry, would not give her the theater of an emotional woman. That was the role she had written for me. and I had no intention of playing it. I would be calm and exact and thorough at a volume that required everyone in the room to be entirely silent to hear me. "I know you've been planning this since before we moved in," I said. "I know you highlighted sections of my grandmother's will the summer after the funeral. I know Daniel had my signature witnessed on a document he told me was an insurance update last spring. I found the email from the Ashford solicitor confirming the preliminary signature sample had been received. I know you approached an estate agent 3 months ago about a valuation of the cottage, because I spoke to him this afternoon and he remembered your name and the address. You've been working on this for over a year, and you wrote, in your own handwriting, that I would understand eventually, as though my understanding were a minor inconvenience that would resolve itself in time." Something shifted in the room. Eleanor's composure developed a hairline fracture, a compression around the eyes, the face of a woman who has realized her opponent arrived better prepared than expected. Daniel made a sound that was not a word, and when I looked at him, his arms had fallen and he was staring at the carpet. "I have one question," I said to Eleanor. "Did you believe, even for a single moment, that I would find out and not fight back?" Silence. "You built your entire plan on the assumption that I was the person you needed me to be. Manageable, accommodating, too invested in keeping the peace to risk the confrontation. You were right about what I was. You were wrong about what I was capable of becoming." I looked at Daniel. He raised his eyes, and in his face I saw the thing I would have given almost anything 6 months earlier, never to see. The full and unambiguous knowledge of what he had done, held there without defense. He said, barely a voice, "Sara, I'm sorry. I didn't think she'd actually... I thought I could manage it." "You always think you can manage it," I said. "That is the problem. You have been managing her your entire life and calling it love, and you managed her right into my home, my grandmother's deed, and my forged signature. That's not something I can manage my way past." I walked out without looking back. The chrysanthemum petals were scattered across the damp front step, small and orange and finished, and I stepped over them carefully on my way to the car. The weeks that followed were sharp and practical, and entirely without the exhausting softness of hoping things would resolve themselves. Martin reversed the deed amendment in 4 days. A formal police report was filed for document fraud. The Law Society inquiry into the Ashford practice concluded in February. It was not, I was told, the first complaint that office had received. The solicitor closed his doors the same month. Eleanor's brother stopped returning her calls. The estate agent she had approached found himself less forthcoming with her subsequent inquiries. Small collapses in the architecture of a plan built on the assumption that no one would look. Daniel came to the cottage twice in the first month. The second time, he left a letter. Honest, sad, the genuine remorse of a man who has understood too late that the distance between watching something terrible happen and actively participating in it is not, in the end, very large. I read it at the kitchen table and put it in the drawer beside the photo booth strip from Portugal and sat for a long time looking at the cherry tree in its winter skeleton, all structure and no ornament, honest in its nakedness, and thought about what it means to finally see the shape of a thing clearly. And then it was April, 8 months later. 7 in the evening, a glass of wine, the particular silence I had spent those months learning to love, and a knock at my door. I pressed my back against the hallway wall and let the memory complete itself. I had come the full distance from that Tuesday morning with the pale blossoms and the coffee smell and the whole unguarded weight of a life I believed in, to this. A woman standing in her own hallway, her grandmother's deed in a safe deposit box, her name alone on every document that mattered. His voice came again. "Sara, I know you're in there. My mother wrote a letter. She's willing to apologize. Can you just open the door?" Willing to apologize. He had brought it like a voucher. I thought of Eleanor at her writing desk, composing an apology in the same precise looping script that had once written she always does, and I felt absolutely nothing about its cost. I set my wine glass on the hall table, walked to the door, and opened it. He looked exactly the same, which was the first surprise. It seemed like a person who had done what he had done should be visibly marked by it. He held an envelope. Behind him, the lane was quiet, and the cherry tree was in its first pale bloom, the same blossoms that had been there the morning I had stood at this window and believed, whole and unguarded, in everything. "I'm ready to forgive you," he said. It was an extraordinary sentence. I held it in the April air between us and watched it lose its shape. "I know," I said. "That must feel very good." I took the envelope from his hand, gently without snatching, held it for a moment, then placed it carefully back into his, folded his fingers around it, and stepped back. "Goodbye, Daniel." Not with anger, not with ceremony, just with the quiet, complete finality of a woman who has already left a place and is simply, at long last, closing the door behind her. The latch clicked. The hallway smelled of wood and old plaster and the wine cooling on the table. I stood in it, this house that had been my grandmother's and was now entirely mine, in every sense that mattered, and felt something open in my chest like a window, clean and cold and very good. Some things, once broken, cannot be repaired. That used to seem like a loss. I have learned slowly and at considerable cost that it is sometimes simply an instruction,